Well, let's hear more about those meetings from Yukon Premier Ranj Pillai. He is with me in studio. Premier, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, 2 weeks ago, you said that you had been disappointed in the federal government's fall economic statement because there was no new funding for infrastructure and that there was nothing new in terms of disaster response after what has been a terrible wildfire season. So in Ottawa this week, talking about priorities for Yukon, what have you been hearing back from the federal government?
Yeah, look, we know there's lots of restraints on the fall economic statement, and we know that there's challenging times when it comes to building out the 24 budget as well. But look, I think that we had some promising meetings. I think the conversations with the Prime Minister as well as the Finance Minister have given us some hope about what we can see going into the spring. It was my role as the chair of Western Premiers Conference that is where we actually had communicated with the Prime Minister and said, look, we really think we're in a position right now to look at mitigation, especially for forest fires after last summer. So we're going to still be pushing and hope to see something in the springtime that can help us to make sure our communities are ready for next summer.
Now, you actually visited our set at the Liberal Convention earlier this year, also here in Ottawa, and you talked with Michael Serapi about the importance of critical minerals to Yukon's economic future. You talked about the need for a regulatory framework to really let that sector take off and how that might affect Yukon. What specifically are you looking for from the federal government, and what did you hear back from the Prime Minister on this?
Look, it's a priority here in Canada. It's a priority all around the world. We had an opportunity this week, last week, to be in London at an international resource conference. There was ministers that got together at Westminster to talk about this. There is a real focus throughout the EU, Canada, Australia. People know that we need to get this right. The meetings were good this week. I had a chance again to bring up the fact that we need some work done on the regulatory side with the Prime Minister, and we need the right infrastructure in place to make these projects happen. And I think the other conversation that was really important was with Seamus O'Regan yesterday, who's chairing the regulatory table around critical minerals, and it was a good conversation. I mean, what we've said in Ottawa this week is really, look, first thing you have to do is make sure that the relationship with First Nations is right. Make sure that companies are coming and meeting with First Nation governments, first and foremost, and then we have to make sure we have the infrastructure and the regulatory regime in place to really seize this opportunity.
All right, well, let's turn to housing. Sure. A lot of topics on your agenda this week, and not enough time to talk about it all. So let's talk about housing. What do you see as the key barriers to getting more affordable housing in Yukon?
Look, we've had really strong economic growth over the last number of years. We've had the strongest population growth from a percentage standpoint in the country, really from 2013 to now. So we need to have different types of housing, and we've had real pressure. And so what we're looking for, I'm in Toronto tomorrow, and it's really looking at institutional investment. It's looking at pension funds. It's looking at folks that have a long-term view to these investments. We need more rental housing. We need market rental as well as affordable housing. So we're hoping to match that money up with builders and developers in the Yukon so we can come up with the right solutions for the growth of our economy. And
so what do you think of the debate over housing that we have here in Ottawa right now between Liberals, between the Liberal government on one hand and what we're hearing from the Conservative leader just recently in his 15-minute video about the housing market?
Yeah, look, I think that everybody tries to make it more simplistic than it is. It's a complex conversation. In the Yukon, it's really focused on the fact that we have First Nation governments that have a real opportunity to play a significant role in land development and housing development. They're doing it now, and we're doing it in partnership with them. I met with Minister Fraser. I like what I'm hearing about how he wants to tackle some of the challenges. So the key is there's been good announceables, but now we have to see the real program development come in. We need to see deployment of capital. We need to make sure that the deployment of capital is done right with as much reduction in regulatory or challenges that we can possibly have. We want to make sure the application processes are streamlined, and we have to do this quick. So I think that's what I'm hearing from Minister Fraser. Now we have to make sure that CMHC can get that done across this country.
Okay, let's turn to healthcare. As part of your visit here this week, your government signed a letter of intent for a Yukon First Nations-led healing center. Tell me about the significance of that and what it's going to mean.
Yeah, I think it's important for the country to know, and for your listeners, we were here because we were celebrating the unique relationship between the Yukon government and First Nations leaders and the federal government. And it's all based in work from 50 years ago called Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. And so we were celebrating that on the Hill. The first major policy piece that we looked at while we were here was Minister Hadju coming in and signing an agreement with our First Nation governments and the Yukon government exactly for this particular project. It's really important. This is a challenge across the country, but it's a big challenge in the Yukon. We've dealt with a real challenge with opioids, and we need to have the right infrastructure in place. So good leadership by First Nations governments in the Yukon and the federal government working alongside Yukon government. So we're happy to see that happen.
Okay, let me end with a question for you about carbon pricing. Sure. A lot of debate here in Ottawa today on carve-outs, on exemptions. We know there's been an exemption for home heating oil. We know there's work being done on heat pumps. We know there are calls for exemptions for First Nations, for farmers. Where is that debate for you as Yukon Premier right now?
Yeah, look, this is, of course, premiers got together in Halifax, and the real discussion was, let's make sure that we have an approach to the country that's balanced. And I think I spoke to the fact that there was a bit of a carve out in Atlantic Canada. Some of that has affected us. We do have an opportunity to pull some program dollars back to the Yukon, and we're going to do that. Look, we are on the front lines of climate change, and yes, this has become a political football. But the reality is we have floods and fires happening in our backyard. I know in the Yukon, Yukoners want us to do the right thing. We want to be on the right side of history, and we want to make sure that there's a strategy to deal with climate change. And there's a lot of rhetoric on some sides, and we feel that the work that's been done over the last couple of years, we need to stick with that work. What we're doing is the price on carbon that we have, we give most Yukoners get more money back than what they paid. We think that structure and system is solid. But when you start to tweak little areas of it, it really starts to erode. And so we've said that to the Prime Minister's office, we've said that to the other ministers, and we really need to ensure that we don't lose sight of this really, really important challenge in front of all of us, not just in Canada, but across the world.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Yukon Premier Ranj Pillai, I want to thank you so much for coming in.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Okay.